welcome everybody. Welcome to the Jesus Movement Live. We are on our Journey to Faith series, as we are every Wednesday night at approximately 7 p.m. Tonight, it's a great joy. We have a new screen operating behind us, which will enable us to put up all of the images associated with the lesson to help your understanding and learning. So I pray that you enjoy that. Tonight's lesson, as you can see, is called Jesse, Samson and the Philistine oppression of the Israelites. So we're in that part of the Bible. We're getting towards the end of the period of Judges. We're following the genealogy of Jesus, and of course Jesse is the father of David, who becomes the second king and the first king who will unite Israel together. At this point in time, last week, we had a look at the early part of Jesse's life and what was going on through the book of Judges and 1 Samuel. It's important to understand that Samson the Nazarite, Eli the priest, and Samuel the prophet, who was also a Nazarite, they all actually lived at the same time, and they were all had various roles during the period of time of the Philistines, who were ruling for 40 years. So we're going to begin tonight by opening up about Abdon, who was the last ruler, who was a ruler in Israel. And last week we put up some map of all the different leaders and where they actually ruled from throughout the land of Israel. So Abdon, he was actually the 10th judge, and he ruled from a place which was on the border between the territory of Ephraim and West Manasseh above Jerusalem. So when he died, his news spread around Israel, but the Lord actually didn't raise up a new ruler, for the people of Israel had continued to worship the gods of the nations around them. They continued to sacrifice their children on altars to idols. They continued to seek temple prostitutes at the high places. They were superstitious and wicked. And in Judges 13:1, it says, they did evil in the eyes of the Lord, so the Lord delivered them into the hands of the Philistines. This did not include every Israelite in the land, though, for some were still obedient to the Lord. So turning now to Jesse, who is living in this time, his household and others from Bethlehem were faithful to the Lord. They packed their donkeys early in the year 1110 BC, in the month of Nisan, to head south down the way to Shur, to Hebron, which is the highway that goes through the middle of Israel. So I'm going to pop a map on, which is going to show you where that is. This map is for the next portion, but this is the way to Shur here. It comes all the way down, and it goes all the way through and across the peninsula of the Sinai, across to Egypt, and back up again through here. And so this is the place that we're talking about when we're talking about the way to Shur. So they went to Hebron, and in Deuteronomy chapter 16 verses 5 to 6, it says, "You must not sacrifice the Passover in any town the Lord gives you, except in the place he will choose as a dwelling for his name. There you must sacrifice the Passover in the evening when the sun goes down on the anniversary of your departure from Egypt." So what's happening here is that despite everything that's going on, there was times of year in which people had to go and take their offerings and observe the ordinances that God had put into place. And so the closest place to this for Jesse was actually in Hebron. It was one of the priestly cities. So Jesse is living here in Bethlehem, and here's Hebron just here. So that's the closest place for the people to go to a priestly city. So this is where he would have travelled to. So they would have taken a small flock of lambs and a small herd of kid goats, and his household, they would have left on the 13th of Nisan to make sure that he not only arrived on the 14th, but that he was there in good time. He needed to bring his sacrifice to the altar by 3 o'clock in the afternoon. And so what we're doing here is we're teaching into an area of the everyday life of what they would have experienced. And so these are the regulations that they had to follow. The 14th of Nisan was the Passover before the Feast of Unleavened Bread. Jesse would have selected a particularly unblemished 1-year-old lamb. He would take it to the priest, the throat of the animal was cut and the blood of the animal was caught in a gold cup, then passed down a row of priests until it reached the altar where the last priest sprinkled its contents on the altar. Once this was done, they hung the lamb up on hooks and removed its entrails. Once it was cleansed, the fat of the lamb was offered on the altar. The lamb was also skinned. Whilst this was happening, some Levites who stood on a platform called a Dukan, which is spelled D-U-K-A-N, recited what is known as the Hallel, which is spelled H-A-L-L-E-L. And you can read this Hallel in Psalms, and it goes from Psalms 113 to 118. So this is something that they would recite at this time. So you can read that and avail yourself of that. So brass instruments played constantly throughout this time. So this is painting a picture of what it would have been like when he went and what they were required to do. After the sacrifice was complete, Jesse collected his cleaned and skinned lamb and left. It was required that the lamb of the sacrifice had to be taken home, roasted and eaten on the same evening. Too far to travel home in the same evening, Jesse took it back to his lodgings and roasted it on a spit of pomegranate wood. Now you may wonder, where am I getting all this from? But this is actually what they had to do. It's all specified in the Bible. And so this is what the people in Israel were required to do on these days. He had to be careful when they ate it because none of the bones were allowed to be broken when the lamb was cooked. Once it was cooked, it was shared with all of the members from his household who had travelled with him, but they too had to be careful for none of the bones could be broken when it was eaten. So there's a lot of regulations involved in what they actually had to do when they made their sacrifices. A banquet had been set up on the table in their lodgings that evening, inviting everyone to sit down. Jesse stood at the head of the table and gave the required benediction before they ate the lamb. And he would say, Baruch atah, Adonai Eloheinu melech ha'olam. And that means, blessed are you, Lord our God, King of the universe, who has sanctified us by your commands and has ordained that we should eat the Passover. Saying Amen together in unison, Jesse would then sit down. As they ate together, Jesse recited the same Hallel that I mentioned earlier to his own household that he had heard the Levites recite at the time of the sacrifice. When the meal was finished, he went on to explain the meaning of the custom and tell the story of the Exodus from Egypt. So you may remember a little bit earlier this year we actually came together and we were led in Passover, and this is actually what we were blessed to participate in. And so the traditions that are followed on today are born out of these times from the Bible, and these traditions of course were given by God when they were in Mount Sinai, when the Israelites were formed into a nation. And so it was something that they all had to practice. The next morning, when Jesse and his household woke up, they would have not gone home either, for they would stay to celebrate the festival of unleavened bread that started in the evening. For 7 days, each morning and evening, they would make a sacrifice and eat only unleavened bread. On the second day, it was different from the others, for a sheaf of barley was also symbolically offered to the Lord by waving it rather than burning it. At this time, Jesse also made a peace or a joy offering, a gift that he had prepared that was proportionate to the way the Lord had blessed him. And this blessing is found in Deuteronomy chapter 16, verse 17. So when we read the Bible, I find that a lot of the laws and regulations and ordinances are obviously in certain books, Leviticus, Deuteronomy, especially Numbers as well, and it can be perhaps dry reading, but when we apply them into the lives of these people in the Bible and bring it to life, you get a little bit of a snapshot of what it would have looked like for them. Knowing where the priestly cities were and knowing where Jesse lived, we can also paint a picture of where they would have actually travelled to make their offering. So after this, Jesse would have headed home with his household after the festival had finished. And even after having given thanks to the Lord for his provision and protection, he still couldn't help but feel apprehensive. Why? Because news would have reached him whilst he was staying in Hebron, telling of how the Philistines had started to raid the hill country where his hometown of Bethlehem was. And so we enter into this period of time when one ruler, Abdon, who was ruling over the Israelites, had passed away, and suddenly at this time of year, after they celebrated these festivals, we find that the period of the Philistines, who are going to rule for 40 years, has actually begun. And so Jesse's time, where we learnt in the previous week, he'd lived through times of peace, and he lived through times of distressing raids and abuse, murder, etc., when he was a little boy, and then he'd had many, many years of peace. So now we're going to go into a period of time where it's not peaceful again. This time with the Philistines is also the last period of time that the Israelites are going to be ruled by a foreign body of people. So this is the last time during the period of Judges where the Israelites are not going to be able to stand up to somebody who comes against them. Now, to the west of Bethlehem, the hill country of Judah falls away with deep V-shaped valleys cut into the hard limestone. And so we're talking about Judah, and so the tribe of Judah basically starts just beneath Jerusalem, because this is the tribe of Benjamin here. So all of this is all the tribe of Judah, and what happens is this is all the hill country in the lighter shade, and as it goes down, it goes to the coastal plain here. There's a series of darker lines here which represent where the valleys score up into the actual hills themselves. And so this is where the next part of the story of the Bible plays out in this region, and this is what's known as the Shiloh Valley. Okay, so if you can picture this, there's the Mediterranean, there's the coastal plain, it goes up the escarpment, and then we've got what's called the hill country here. It suddenly drops away where the Dead Sea is, and if you're aware, the Dead Sea is actually below ground level. And so there's a great big fall here. So this whole ridge, all the way up and down here, is known as the hill country, and then it flattens out and goes into the desert, and the Negev when we get down to Beersheba, and of course down to the Sinai Peninsula. So just to paint a picture of what this terrain was looking like, because this is actually going to dictate what happens in the story that the Bible gives us. So as I said, this gives way to a broader and flatter valleys, and they're all limestone, and it's worn and it's softer and it's chalkier. As I said, named collectively as the Shiloh Valley, there are actually 6 of these valleys in succession, ranging from the north of Jerusalem southwards past Bethlehem, covering an area roughly 24 kilometres or 15 miles in length. The Philistines, living on the coastal plains, and I'll just point them out again, and so this is the Philistines. So here up to Jaffa, we've got Ashdod, Ashkelon, Gaza, Gerar, Gath, Ekron, all of these regions here. This is the land of the Philistines. So it was actually known as Philistia in the day. So this is the region where they're occupying on the coast. Okay. So living on the coastal plains, the Philistines, they'd use these valleys as corridors to climb up into the hill country, and whoever controlled these corridors not only controlled access to the coastal trade routes going north to south, but controlled critical roads leading into Judah's heartland. It is into the northern end of this region, in the allotment of land given to the tribe of Dan, to the west of Jerusalem, that a man named Manoah from Zorah fathered a son in 1110 BC. Any guesses who his son is? Samson. Right, so his son is Samson, so in 1110 BC, so not long before the time of David. So Manoah of Zorah was from the clan of Danites, and it says in Judges 13 chapter 2 that he had a wife who was sterile and remained childless. An angel of the Lord appeared to her and told her that she would conceive and give birth to a son. Samson was no ordinary boy though. And it says in Judges 13 verse 5, no razor may be used on his head, because the boy is to be a Nazarite, set apart to God from birth, and he will begin the deliverance of Israel from the hands of the Philistines. And so we see here that Samson is like Samuel, who we spoke about last week. He was a boy. He was from a mother who also couldn't have a child, whose womb was closed up. And when she used to go and see Eli and take her yearly offering, she would pray to be able to have a son. When she prayed to be able to have a son, she said that she would dedicate her son to the Lord, and that's what she did. She gave her son into the priesthood as a little boy, and so he too was a Nazarite and didn't shave or cut his hair. And so we find here at the beginning of the time of the Philistines, we have two Nazarites, both dedicated to God, one in the priesthood, one as the leader, and they're both from the times of the Philistines. And so when we read our Bible as separate books, we sometimes miss this, because one is spoken about in one book, the other is spoken about in the other book, and we don't necessarily realise that they were living at the same time, and yet they were. The man and woman took a young goat and a grain offering and sacrificed it to the Lord, the Bible tells us. She conceived and gave birth to a boy, and of course his name was Samson, as we just mentioned. In Judges chapter 13 verses 24 to 25, it says, he grew up and the Lord blessed him, and the Spirit of the Lord, so we're talking about the Holy Spirit, began to stir him while he was in a place called Mahanadan, between Zorah and Eshtaol. And so I'm going to go back to the map again, and we can see these places on the map. So here's Zorah here, and here's Eshtaol. And so they lived in between the two places there. So here's Jesse up at Bethlehem. There they are, right there on the junction between the plains and the hill country where these gorges would go up. And so this is where Samson was born. It's impossible not to see the similarities between the two people that God set apart to deliver the Israelites from Philistine rule and oppression. Both Samson and Samuel were born by mothers who had been unable to conceive without the help of the Lord. Both Samson and Samuel were set apart to God. Both Samson and Samuel were Nazarites with no razor allowed to cut their hair, and both Samson and Samuel's lives were purposely created to overcome the Philistines. And so we see these extraordinary parallels between these two well-known people in the Bible, where God actually set them apart for a time such as this. They were conceived purposely to come against the Philistines. God had a plan for them, and he knew what was going to happen, obviously, and how it needed to happen through these particular people. Why do you think, and you can answer on Facebook as well, why do you think God set apart two such people at the time of the Philistines? So God set them apart. So what's been happening for almost 400 years at this point in time? Oppression. We've got oppression, right? So we're during the time of Judges, so there's oppression. God actually said that he was going to punish the people severely. He told them that all sorts of ghastly things were going to happen to them if they did not obey him and worship him only. And so we find during the period of the time of Judges that people constantly went away from God if he didn't raise up a leader. The Bible tells us that God raised up a leader. So in other words, there was nobody who was standing up of their own accord to stand for God amongst his people. So God would raise up leaders, and when they would pass away, I guess it was almost like a test. What's going to happen? But as soon as they passed away, the people went back to their evil ways. And so God would raise up another leader. He would punish them again. And so we'd see this cycle of sin, punishment, rescue, restoration. It would go around and around. 400 years worth and nothing changed. And so at this point in time, God says, okay, I need to change it up a bit. I need to raise up some people who are set apart, which means they're no longer there to represent the people to him, they're actually set apart to him, to represent him to the people. And so we see this significant shift, because there comes a point in time where things just can't stay the same. And so God moves in at this point in time, and he selects these two particular people, and he knows whom they are. Now, one of them is an extremely quiet, peaceful man, and the other one is going to be an extremely violent and vulgar man, and yet God has a purpose for both of them. And so we can see through this that God doesn't always select certain type of people for what he wants them to do. He chooses many different type of people with many different attributes, and when we read the story as we're about to of Samson, you could almost question, why on earth would God challenge this person? Choose this person. But it's because of that other word I just slipped into, challenge, because he wanted to challenge the Philistines. He actually wanted to wreak havoc, and he's going to use this man who he was going to give a very special gift to wreak havoc upon these people. Okay, so when Samson had grown up and the Holy Spirit began to stir him into action, this was in essence an activation to begin a sequence of events that would lead to the downfall of the Philistine oppression of the Israelites. And I just have a picture here of Samson. Now Samson, the Bible tells us, was a red-headed man. And so this illustration shows him with his red hair. We're just about to come to the story. You can see a lion there in the background, and you can see him eating honeycomb in the foreground. So we'll come to that story in a moment, but I'll just put the picture up now to get a representation. You can see he has his payos, so the long tassels on either side of his hair, defining that he was set apart, he was a man of God, and of course he's depicted with this thick mass of hair as well. So we'll leave the picture of Samson up for the moment while we continue on with his story. So translating the original Hebrew word for stir, because the Bible says that Samson's going to stir up. When we actually have a look at it, it actually has a much more forceful meaning than what we get from reading in English in our Bible. And it actually translates into words such as strike, hit, harass, or afflict. So God selected this man to come and wreak havoc, basically. Not to be polite, not to say, can you, but to actually go out and to cause havoc. And so when he says that he sent him to stir them up, he wasn't ridiculing them or having a pun or a laugh or challenging them in a very soft way. He was going to do something much stronger. And so it was that Samson's actions became a sequence of harassment and conflict that are so over the top that the Philistines were forced to respond. 20 years had passed when Samson went down to a place called Timnah, and this is the place on the map again. I'll just reverse back to the map. I'm sorry, I'm just going to keep using this map to help you out because the Bible is full of names. And so this is Timnah here. And so he's born here, and it says that he went down to this place called Timnah, as you can see there. And that's following that yellow arrow on this journey. He went there to meet and talk with this woman. Samson killed a lion with his bare hands when it tried to attack him, returning a second time to marry the Philistine woman. Samson found the lion's carcass, and we'll just pop this picture back on again. So there's the lion's carcass, and when he found it, he noticed there was a swarm of bees. Found that they had actually formed a nest in the carcass itself. He scooped some of the honey with his hands and ate it, and he says that in Judges 14 verses 8 to 9 that he also shared it with his parents, and they too ate of it. Now I happen to have a can here with me, and this can is called Lyle's Golden Syrup. And so I have a few English people here with me, and they all know what it is in South African. So they all know what this is, but on the front of the can, it actually shows a picture of this lion, and it might be hard to see, but there's a swarm of bees floating above the actual can. But what it actually reads underneath it, it says, "Out of the strong came forth sweetness. So we're talking about the honey that came out of the lion. So they've used this. These are Jewish people who've formed this product. Okay, but the point is that actually it has a message to say, and it talks about out of the strong. Obviously, the lion is perceived as a very strong animal, the Lion of Judah, Jesus himself. And so we find here that this honey, this sweetness that came out of it, there's a purpose. There's almost a parallel story going on here, that Samson was strong and he was mighty, but he was actually doing God's work, and there was a sweetness to what he was there to do. Unfortunately, the journey he's on right now is not going to play out well. When they arrived, Samson's father Manoah went to see the woman. Customary for the groom to prepare a feast, Samson invited 30 companions from amongst the Philistines to join him. And so I have another picture here, and this shows a picture of Samson standing there, and so you can see all of the other gentlemen all around, and Samson. So he has a purpose to what he's about to do. So Samson gave these 30 Philistines a riddle that they couldn't solve, so that he could earn 30 linen garments and sets of clothes. It was custom for the feast to go for 7 days. And on the 4th day, Samson's new wife was threatened by those men for the answer to the riddle. They said if she didn't answer them, they would burn her, her father, and their household to death. Horrified, she pleaded with Samson until on the 7th day of the feast he told her. She passed this on and they solved the riddle. So Samson needed to give each of them a linen garment and set of clothes. The Holy Spirit came upon him and he went down to Ascalon. And so I'm going to return to the back again. So I'm just smiling. I've got my good friend Tim here adjusting the camera for us as I keep going back and forth. And so he goes from where he was at Timnah and he goes down to Ascalon. And so there's a highway here, a coastal highway, and he's travelling down and he's come down to Ascalon. So this is where he went. And when he was there, he killed 30 other Philistine men to get their clothes. And so he went there with a riddle to get clothes. His wife asked him for the answer because she was worried about being murdered, as was her father. And so, of course, he went down and murdered 30 Philistines instead and still got his clothes. And so we see something of the character of Samson. Samson felt betrayed, and in his anger, he returned to his father's house. So his new father-in-law gave up his wife to a friend who was one of the 30 men who attended Samson's wedding. So obviously news of him going to Ascalon to get this clothing turned against him. Samson cooled down and returned with a young goat as a peace offering, but his father-in-law would not let him into the house. So Samson set out to extract revenge. Does anyone know what he did before we speak about it? Shows the state of mind of Samson. Does anyone remember what he did?
Catch foxes?
He caught foxes.
Oh,
that's right.
Yeah.
Yeah, so he plays a devastating and cruel, not a trick, but an outcome. He planned something to come against these people. And so what he did, he tied a torch to the tails of 300 foxes. So I'll let you picture that. Tying a torch, so we're talking about a flaming torch, to 300 foxes who he then tied together by their tails and released them to run throughout their fields, vineyards and olive groves, burning everything in their path. As it was the time of the seasonal wheat harvest, the Philistines lost their source of food and trade for a whole year. They were so incensed that they took Samson's wife and her father and burnt them to death. And so we find that what they threatened in the first place, they ended up doing anyway. So what we see here, if we think about Samson and we think about what God said, they said that they were going to send him to harass and to cause conflict. And so what's happened? He asked his mum and dad to marry a Philistine woman. Right? When he went there, he had to have this wedding party. At the wedding party, he wanted to acquire these clothes. He had a riddle for them, as was customary, because they wanted to know and they didn't want to give him the clothes. Remember, he's an Israelite. They threatened his wife, or his wife-to-be, with death by burning and the father and all of his lands. And so she gave the riddle away, and so Samson then reacted by going to Ascalon and killing 30 men anyway in order to get the clothes. He then came back, and the father gave his daughter away to spite him, and then as a consequence he sent 300 foxes with their tails lit throughout the properties to burn everything that existed. And then as a consequence of that, the father burnt his wife, and the people burned the wife and the father-in-law as well. And so we see this whole episode is absolutely horrific that's happened. So Samson's really fulfilling what he set out to do, to harass and cause conflict. But you see his actions were actually a problem, because he went to marry a Philistine woman. And God's laws said that they weren't to intermingle or to marry people from another nation. And so the consequence for it didn't go well. So after they were burnt to death, Samson attacked and slaughtered many of them, swearing ongoing revenge. He left and he went to a cave in a rock called Etam, and it says this is described in Judges 15, verses 1 to 8. So on the map here, I have the location for the cave of Etam, and this is over here. And so this red line represents him going across to this cave here at Etam. So you can see all of this is playing out in the Shiloh Valley here, right where Jesse peacefully is living up in Bethlehem above, and it's not going to bode well as a consequence. So again, that's the cave of Etam there. Okay. So it wasn't over, for the Philistines went up into the hill country of Judah and spread out near Lehi, which is right next to the cave of Etam here. The men of Judah in the area asked in Judges 15 verse 10, "Why have you come to fight us?" To which they responded, "We have come to take Samson prisoner to do to him as he did to us." And so the cycle of violence continues. Meanwhile, back in the town of Bethlehem, where Jesse is up on the top of the hill country, people had heard the story of this man called Samson from the tribe of Dan, who had set fire to the crops of the Philistines in and around Timnah after they burnt his wife to death. Jesse was sitting by the town gate discussing these events with the other elders when a messenger came running to town, warning them that a number of Philistines had set up camp not far from them in one of the valleys coming up from the coastal plains. When they asked him why, he told them that Samson had settled in one of the limestone caves at the rock of Etam, just near Lehi. Fear was struck into their hearts. They did not wish to enter into an open conflict with the Philistines. Remember that Bethlehem's a very small town. They have no army, they have no weapons, so they're really not looking for any conflict here. So Jesse joined the leaders from the many towns of Judah who came together to discuss how to handle the situation. They decided that rather than sit back and risk being raided by these Philistines, they would assemble a large number of men to go down to meet with Samson and hand him over to their enemy. The men, who were 20 years or older, went with their elders from Bethlehem and made their way down the valley to Lehi. Arriving, they assembled with the men from the other towns. And so on the map here again, these green lines represent these towns that we're talking about in the Bible, and they came down from these various locations to assemble together here at Lehi, where these circumstances were happening. Arriving, they assembled with the men from the other towns. They were 3,000 in number, and went down to the cave in the rock of Etam together, and said to Samson in Judges 15 verse 11, "Do you realise that the Philistines are rulers over us? What have you done to us?" Samson replied, seemingly oblivious to the danger he had placed them all in verse 11 as well, a bit further on, "I merely did to them what they did to me." And so he seems to be justified with his actions. So ever since he started off to get married, he's caused these problems, and there's been a reaction and a counter-reaction the whole way through, but he sees that as the offence of the other people. So Jesse at this time, now aged 66, would have had some of his sons with him, and he joined in chorus with the leaders from the various towns who said to Samson in Judges 15 verse 12, "We've come to tie you up and hand you over to the Philistines." Samson seemed to accept their answer and said to them, again in verse 12, "Swear to me that you won't kill me yourselves." They agreed, and some of the younger men bound him with new ropes and led him up from the rock and headed back towards Lehi. As they approached with Samson at the head of the large group, the Philistines recognised him and came forward shouting. Jesse stopped walking as did the others, and as the tension mounted, they witnessed something extraordinary. The new ropes that had been used to bind Samson, it says in verse 14 of Judges 15, became like charred flax, and the bindings dropped from his hands. So here we learn about this incredible strength that Samson actually had. Jesse and the others would have been dumbfounded watching this happen, and before anyone could react, Samson started searching around himself along the edge of the road, and spotting a fresh jawbone of a dead donkey, he bent over and picked it up and then ran forward with it towards the Philistines, screaming at the top of his lungs. And so we're going to put on another picture here. And here's a picture of Samson with what is a donkey's jawbone and what it looks like. You can see the sheer size of it. It's quite a large object. If it was the whole jawbone, what he's holding in his hand there is only half, because the jawbone curves around and has the two sides. But they're quite large and they're quite heavy. And so this is what he actually picked up to use as a weapon to come against the Philistines. The Bible tells us that when he reached them, he attacked in a frenzy, and they were not ready for him. As the men of Judah stood there, Samson hacked his way through 1,000 Philistines and boasted when he had finished in Judges 15 verse 16, "With a donkey's jawbone I have made donkeys of them. With a donkey's jawbone I have killed 1,000 men." He tossed the jawbone aside and cried out to the Lord in Judges 15 verse 18, "You have given your great servant this victory. Must I now die of thirst and fall into the hands of the uncircumcised?" God opened up a spring of water called En Hakor, which means the caller's spring. Samson drank, his strength returned, and he was revived. Samson boasted, "I have killed 1,000 men," but if you notice in the scripture, he didn't credit the Lord with the victory for breaking his bonds and the extraordinary strength that he actually had to fight. Although he acknowledged God for his victory, he then arrogantly demanded water. Fortunately, he did the Lord's work, and God mercifully sustained him despite his arrogance. Jesse and the men of Judah realised that these events they had just witnessed was the power of the Holy Spirit. They understood that Samson's strength was like none other, and from that day forward, in Judges 15 verse 20 it says, Samson led Israel for 20 years in the days of the Philistines. And so we find here that Samson becomes a leader because he's overcome his enemy. Now in 1961, this ancient site of Beit Lehi, which means the house of Lehi, was discovered in the eastern part of the Lachish region of Judah. In the Bible, every location is named for a reason, and Beit Lehi is no exception. Beit means house, as I've mentioned, or dwelling, and Lehi means jawbone. And so the place today is named after the jawbone. And so this refers to the place where Samson slew 1,000 Philistines. And so a few years ago, I had the pleasure of going to Israel with my good friend Roger. And when we went there was an olive tree with something hanging from it, which Roger spotted and said there's something white hanging in that tree. When I saw it, I knew immediately what it was. The reason I knew what it was is because before I went to Israel, I was writing about this very story in the Bible, and I just had looked at this picture of him holding the jawbone. And in it, with a piece of string, this was tied to the olive tree. Here you can see me holding this, and this is the size of the jawbone. Now it's actually dried out, but you can see it's almost the width of me. It's a big bone, and you can see it's quite a weapon. So I was tickled pink to find this bone, and of course we decided that I would take it home with us. And so I have this here with me, and I'm going to show this to you. I'm going to take it out of the Galilee's Miracles bag. And I've kept this, and this was extraordinary because when I took it, and Roger and I spoke about it, I didn't know I was going to be able to bring it home because it's a bone, and we didn't know whether it was actually hygienic or not. And so here's the bone that I took in Israel from that tree. Now, if you look at the size of this, and if I grab hold of this like Samson, you can see it would be a formidable weapon. If I came and cracked you in the head with this, it would do more than hurt. And so you can imagine Samson coming at you screaming with this thing, whacking and killing people as he did. And so this is that jawbone that I found. Where we were was actually the Tell of Gath. Now the Tell of Gath is in the area where all of this actually went down. And so if I went back to the map again, if I can, I'll just flick back through these. You'll see that Gath is here. So in this region where he was, this is where Gath was. So they were moving around here, they were living in these regions, and so this was picked up in Gath. So I had the pleasure when I came home of going through all the customs at all the airports, and they're like, what's that? And my concern was, I was thinking, they're not going to let me bring it through because, you know, organic matter and bones and stuff are a problem. But because it had been hanging in the tree, it was so dry, there was nothing live left in this jawbone. And so I brought it through. So I got to relay at every customs, have you ever read about the story of Samson in the Bible? And so they probably thought I was quite mad. But here it is, I still have it to this day. So this is a precious item that I brought home. It is actually, I checked it out when we came home, it is actually a donkey's jawbone. And so here we were in that region of Israel, we picked up a jawbone, and of course the reason I knew it was because of the Bible, and also because of the illustration that I put up. I had actually seen this picture just before we actually left, so there's a bit of fun with the story of Samson. Okay, so going back to the story, so news of Samson's exploits had spread throughout Israel. Oppressed by the Philistines now for 20 years, they became encouraged and went out to fight against them. The Israelites came down from the hill country and camped at a place called Ebenezer. And so I'm going to put another map on. And this is going to show you that location. So it says they came down, so out of the hill country. This is the road that comes down. So this is Ebenezer. And right next to it is this other place called Affec, which we're just about to speak about. So again, we're now out of the hill country on the plain of Sharon, just above Jaffa, or what's known as Tel Aviv today. And that's where it's located from the Bible. So the Israelites came down to that location, camped there. So the Philistine kings gathered their armies together from the coastal plains and camped nearby at Affec. So that's that other location right next to it. So Affec was on the edge of the Mediterranean coastal plain and the foothills of the hill country. It was a key staging place on the coastal trading route between Egypt and Mesopotamia. So I just want to mention to you now that along the coast of Israel, this road that comes up here was a trading route that would pass through all the way up to Beit Shean, and then from here it would go across the Jordan River, and then it would go up to the north. So the Egyptians were down here, and so this was a trade route which they actually protected. And so when you go to Israel, you'll find there's relics of the period of the Egyptians who ruled over the Philistines. And so up here at Beit Shan, on top of the ancient Tel, there's actually a Egyptian governor's house that's up on top there. And if you go to Jaffa today, there's a thing called the Egypt Gate, which is the town to the original place here. But basically, the Philistine people, they were actually seafaring people, and I'll come to that in a moment, but they were actually placed there by the Egyptians. So they were actually underneath the rule of the Egyptians. They put them there, they used them to protect the trade routes, and they had fortresses with Egyptians posted in them with the Philistines under them. The Egyptians wouldn't have cared less what the Philistines did to the Israelites. As long as they did what they were told along the trade route, anything else was fair game. And so this was the case. But going up the coast from Egypt, up through the Jezreel Valley to Beit Shan, across the other side of Jordan, and up here we go up to northern Mesopotamia, and this was one of the major trade routes in the day at the time. And so this is why they were actually there. So it said Aphek was on the edge of the Mediterranean coastal plain, and it was a strategic location because of the trade route. When the Israelites first invaded the land of Canaan, the king of Aphek had been defeated at the hands of Joshua, it tells us in Joshua chapter 12 verse 18. But they were not able to hold on to Aphek or any of the other cities on the coastal plain, for the armies of the Philistines utilised iron chariots against them on the flat land. Aphek was on the northernmost boundary of this territory, which was known as Philistia. So it's the northern boundary of the Philistine territory. They're controlled by the Philistines, who were a confederation of sea peoples from Crete, Cyprus, and the Aegean Sea. The Egyptians had beaten them in a battle and placed them into the land of Canaan to colonise the fertile coastal plains under their dominion. So that's how they got there in the first place. So Jesse's son, so going back to Jesse now, Jesse's sons hugged and kissed him as they left to fight the Philistines. So Jesse's now in his 60s, so he's not fighting anymore. But these people were called to go and fight against the Philistines, as it happened during the period of Judges. And so he would have been farewelling his sons to battle for the first time. Messengers travelling through the hill country had come down from the north to Bethlehem and called the men to take up arms. As I said, at the age of 66, Jesse no longer joined the army of Israel to fight an enemy, but in 1 Samuel chapter 16, verses 10 to 11, and again in 1 Samuel chapter 17, verse 12, I'll say those again, 1 Samuel chapter 16, verse 10 to 11, and 1 Samuel chapter 17, verse 12. It tells us that Jesse had 8 sons. Eliab, Abinadab, and Shammah were the first 3 born. Jesse's age released him from joining the army of Israel to fight an enemy, but we can take for granted that at least his first 3 sons would have been 20 years or older and able to fight. It was not unusual, as I said, for families to have many children, and Jesse was no exception. So he would have watched as his 3 sons left and headed north along the highway that I've mentioned earlier, the way to Shur. And of course, as young men going off to battle, they probably were chatting excitedly, whereas Jesse would have been concerned at seeing his sons go off to war. Despite the best reassurances of his sons, it was obviously a real possibility that they wouldn't come back, and so Jesse would have been praying for them. When the 3 brothers approached Shiloh, they wouldn't have turned east and they wouldn't have gone into the town there, but they would have continued further through the foothills until they came to this place called Ebenezer, which we pointed out. They greeted those who were closest to them as they set up their tent in the Israelite camp, and looking west further towards the Great Sea, what we know as the Mediterranean today, with the plain spread out below them, they would have been able to see the Philistines in the distance setting up their camp. And so that's how war was in those days. You would have one camp being set up on one side, another camp set up on the other side, and they wouldn't fight until they were both ready. That was the normal way it was done in those days. Early the next morning, after both camps had settled in, The Bible tells us in 1 Samuel, so we move to 1 Samuel now, in chapter 4 verse 2, it says, the Philistines deployed their forces to meet Israel. And as the battle spread, Israel was defeated by the Philistines, who had killed about 4,000 of them on the battlefield. So again, that's 1 Samuel chapter 4 verse 2. Eliab, Abinadab and Shammah had gone down into the heat of battle at the edge of the plain, and they would have fought side by side to protect one another. The Israelites were buckling under the fierce onslaught of the enemy, and men started to fall in bloody heaps all over the battlefield. As dust settled, the battle would cease, and the Israelites would return to their camp at the end of the day. The Philistines would have been jeering at them as they retreated, because they killed 4,000 of them. The Israelites would have been shocked, because they would have thought that their victory was assured, that God was on their side. The Bible tells us that the Israelites thought that one Israelite was worth 1,000 Philistines. So it wasn't the Lord's hand against these Philistines. Jesse's sons and all the men would have been exhausted when they made their way back to camp at the base of the foothills with the other soldiers. The Israelite elders asked, and it says this in 1 Samuel chapter 4 verse 3, why did the Lord bring defeat upon us today before the Philistines? Let us bring the ark of the Lord's covenant from Shiloh, so that it may go with us and save us from the hand of the enemies. Some men were selected to go up to Shiloh. Urgency was imperative. The day was drawing to an end as dust settled, and they would have to run through the night. Sitting in camp, the mood was sombre. Many of the men were tending their wounds, and they were exhausted. Now the distance from their camp to Shiloh was almost 30 kilometres away, or 18 miles. So to go to Shiloh, retrieve the Ark of the Covenant, and return to camp would require a round trip of approximately 60 kilometres, or 36 miles. So clearly returning with the Ark would take longer, because they're going to be carrying something. And so this is where they were to go. As I said, this is up to Shiloh, which is where the high priest Eli was, and the Ark of the Covenant. So when the men returned, the sons of Eli, the priest, were with them. Hophni and Phinehas walked into the camp to a great reception. The soldiers of Israel stood up and shouted. So loud was the reception that the roar of the Israelite soldiers could be heard in the Philistine camp, as you can imagine, not far away. The Philistines asked in 1 Samuel chapter 4 verse 6, what's all the shouting in the Hebrew camp? They learnt that the Ark of the Covenant had just entered the camp of the Israelites, and they were afraid, for in verse 7 they said, a god has come into the camp. This was new for them, for nothing had happened like this before. The Philistines knew the Egyptians who ruled over them had been struck down by plagues sent by Israel's God. If they couldn't defeat the Egyptians who ruled over them, how then could they live under the Israelites? They feared the God of Israel and rallied to fight. The Israelites received the prayers of the priests before the battle, but they were wicked and not faithful to God. When the soldiers went down into battle that day, the Ark of the Covenant was carried amongst them, with Eli's two sons, Hophni and Phinehas, in attendance. The Philistines came out and fought a ferocious battle, and the Bible tells us 30,000 Israelite foot soldiers were killed in one day. In Samuel chapter 4 verse 11 it says, the Ark of God was captured, and Eli's two sons, Hophni and Phinehas, died. So the prophecy that was given to Eli came to pass from 1 Samuel chapter 2 verse 34, which we mentioned last week. And it said, and what happens to your two sons, Hophni and Phinehas, will be a sign to you. They will both die on the same day. And so here it came to pass that they died carrying the Ark of the Covenant in the battle because they were wicked.
May I ask a question? You jump from Samson straight into this battle with the Israelites.
Yes.
Is it because of it's happening at the same time?
That's right.
Why wasn't Samson there?
Well, Samson was a leader in a different region. So the question I was asked, just because of the mic, the question I was asked was this happening at the same time as Samson? Because we're jumping from Samson and we've now gone to Jesse's family and the son's going into battle further north. the answer is that during the time of the judges, if you spend a lot of time in the dating, we find that a lot of the judges were actually regional. So in other words, there was battles that were fought, and we mentioned some last week, where only certain tribes participated in that particular battle. So there was one up in the north, for example. So the people from Judah, they didn't actually participate in the battle at all. There was another battle on the other side of the Jordan River, where the Gileadites were actually fighting, and not all the tribes came onto the other side to fight that one. And so we find during this time of Judges that the Israelites as a body of people, as a nation, are not actually all together.
Okay.
Right? And that's part of the story of Judges. They've been decimated in number during the times of oppression. They would then increase in number during the time of peace. But what would happen is when they had people oppressing them, often these oppressors would be from a particular location, so they would attack a particular region. So here we find it's the Philistines, and they're attacking a certain region, and so certain people are coming against them. But we find that Samson's story is happening in parallel to this other story where these other people are now fighting the Philistines. In other words, they're fighting on more than one front.
Okay.
Yeah, and so it's a valid point. It's actually quite confusing, and so it takes a bit of time reading both of the books of the Bible together to start realising that there's certain stories that happen at the same time during this period of time. So it's very valid. So I just find where I was up to. So not every Israelite died in the battle that day, the Bible tells us. Those who survived fled and ran back to their tents. Eliab, Abinadab and Shammah were amongst them, the sons of Jesse. In 1 Samuel chapter 4 verses 12 to 13 this time, it reads, "That same day a Benjamite ran from the battle line and went to Shiloh, his clothes torn and dust on his head. When he arrived, Eli was sitting on his chair by the side of the road watching, because his heart feared for the ark of God." You might remember last week we spoke about Eli. He used to sit out the front of the temple where the offerings were brought, and he had a three-pronged fork, and every time an offering came in he would take a sample and eat. And so the Bible tells us he was very heavy. So in other words, he was very obese, so he used to just sit on his chair and eat all day. And so his health was a problem at that point in time already. And so we find here that he's moved a little bit further out from the temple onto the side of the road, still on his chair, because he's worried because the Ark of the Covenant was taken by his sons. And so this is where this messenger who came running found him. So entering into town, the Benjamite told what happened, and the whole town cried out. But Eli was still sitting on his chair and hadn't heard the news because he was outside of the town. So this messenger must have just run straight past him, sitting on his chair outside. And so he called out in verse 14 of 1 Samuel chapter 4, "What is the meaning of this uproar?" Because he's blind as well. So he would have heard, but he wouldn't have been able to see. The messenger ran over and told how he had fled the battlefield, running the whole way within the same day. And he said to Eli in verse 17, "Israel fled before the Philistines, and the army suffered heavy losses. Also your two sons, Hophni and Phinehas, are dead, and the ark of God has been captured." As soon as the messenger had said the ark of God was captured, Eli fell backwards off his chair. 98 years old and heavy with weight, he fell badly and broke his neck. He died instantly. He had been a leader or a judge of Israel for 40 years. So, to answer the question that I was just asked, we see that while this battle is happening and he is actually up there, he is a judge and a leader of Israel at the same time of the Philistines, when Samson is also a judge and a leader of the Philistines. And so this is how we start to see that they're integrated together. So the prophecy of the prophet who had spoken to Eli because of the sin of his sons and his failure to stop them came to pass. And in 1 Samuel chapter 2, verse 31 to 32, so going back a couple of chapters, it actually read, "The time is coming when I'll cut short your strength and the strength of your father's house. So there will not be an old man in your family line, and you will see distress in my dwelling." Basically what it means, that's the end of his family. His sons are dead and he's dead. He was the high priest. And so what does this mean? it means the lineage of the high priest has just come to an end. Who did God place in the care of Eli? Samuel. And so Samuel, the boy, who'd been growing up as a priest, a boy priest who wore an ephod, a woven girdle, he's actually been groomed for this position by God. And God obviously knew that this was going to happen because this prophetic word of his was given and relayed to Eli, and now it's just come to pass. So the battle was over. The Philistines packed up their camp and took the captured Ark of the Covenant from Ebenezer to the coastal city of Ashdod. They carried it into the temple of Dagon and set it beside his statue, for they believed they had captured the God of Israel. And so, if we have a look at the map one last time, the battle that happened was over here, and the Ark was captured. Shiloh, where Eli was up here. When they went to get the Ark of the Covenant, they went up and came back. It was captured. The messenger went back to Shiloh, told Eli, and Eli passed away here. Meanwhile, the Ark of the Covenant, it says, was taken to Ashdod. And so the Ark would have been brought down and placed in the temple of Dagon down here at Ashdod. Helps, doesn't it, having a map? We can see what's going on, because there's a lot going on in the Bible with locations. Now, it's important to understand here as well that they captured the Ark of the Covenant. And so, being Philistines, they don't actually believe in a living, true God. They actually have their statues and their idols. And so when they captured the Ark of the Covenant, they actually thought they captured the God of Israel himself. Obviously, God is not in the box, but they believed that that was the case. And so they took it and placed it in their temple because they believed that it would give them more power to have the God of Israel and Dagon in the same temple. So this is why they took it there. The Israelites, however, did not leave so quickly, for God's law required that all of the dead be buried to cleanse the land before bloodshed defiles it. We read this in Numbers chapter 35, verses 33 to 34. So again, Numbers 35, 33 to 34. So when we read stories in the Bible, if we understand all of the laws and the requirements, we can actually paint a much more fuller picture of what's actually going on. So when the battle's actually finished, there's a requirement that they have to actually bury their dead. And so we know when the battle was over, the Philistines would have just left, so the Israelites would have remained behind and make sure that they buried their dead. So the sons of Jesse, Eliab, Abinadab and Shammah, they would have remained at Ebenezer for as long as it took for the survivors of the battle to bury the dead. A mass burial was required and the men split up into groups. One group of scouts who went out to retrieve the corpses, and a second group to dig the graves. It was imperative that not one corpse was missed, for no one could be left to defile the land. Back in Bethlehem, as you can imagine, Jesse would have been pretty anxious. News had reached him that the Israelites had been defeated at the hands of the Philistines, but he still had no news of his sons. Had they survived? Were they wounded? Or were they killed? In reality, they were there burying the dead, but he wouldn't have known that. So he knew it would take some time to know because of this law, for the burial of so many dead would in fact take several months. Remember, in the first day there was 4,000 that were killed, and on the second day it says there was 30,000 killed. So how long would it take to bury 34,000 bodies? So you can imagine digging holes by hand, they had in those days, and burying them with the ceremonial requirements. They would have been there for some time. There was also a mourning period which was required under the law, and so they would have remained in mourning as well. So it would have been several months before they actually went back home to Jesse. Okay, so that brings us to the end of this week's journey. It's a fascinating part of the Bible. It's a part of the Bible where we have to read multiple books at the same time to get a picture of what's going on. We see God's hand and God's plan in this because he's activating more than one person in one place at one time, which is pretty normal as we read in the Bible. God puts his hand on people, he puts things into the hearts of different rulers, and he causes things to happen. Remember, Samson was set apart, and his character was caused by God to incite harassment and conflict, and so we see this actually happening. You've got to realise that Samson was the instigator of all of this stuff. You see, because when he went, there was peace at the time, but when he went down to marry this woman, from that point onwards, everything flared up. Often that's the case, isn't it, in life? One incident turns into a big ugly battle or war, and so we see that this actually happens here. In this part of the Bible, we've learned that both Samson and Eli were both judges or leaders during the period of time of the Philistines. This is why we know there were regional judges and leaders, because the Bible tells us clearly that they both ruled during the time of the Philistines. And in fact, they both died during the time of the Philistines. Right? The Bible tells us clearly that there is only one period of time during the period of Judges across 400 years in which the Philistines ruled, and it was only for 40 years. There was no other time. And so when we read the separate books of the Bible and put them together, we can actually put them in the same time frame, because there was only one time that the Philistines actually ruled. And so we see this coming together of the Nazarites as well, where God put two Nazarites together, as I said, one as a leader, one to become the priest, both at the same time during the period of Philistines. So this was the point in time where everything was going to come to a head, and this is what we start seeing happening. So next week we're going to continue on with Jesse's journey, and we're going to get to the point where we start to introduce David for the first time, and then we'll as we'll see, we'll enter into the period of kings. And so as we've gone through this journey, we go through these variations in the Bible where there's lots of information about some people and less about others. But when again we piece together all of the information from the Bible, we can see a fuller picture for their journey. So thank you for joining us. Thank you for those who have joined us online tonight. I pray you enjoyed the lesson. God bless you, and we look forward to your company next week.